So it's an honor to be introducing Mr. Jamie Wheal. Jamie, can you give a wee hello to let us know that you're here?
Hey folks, nice to see you.
Great. So Jamie is the author of the global bestseller, Stealing Fire, which is really a book that helped to ignite kind of mainstream interest in the topics that we're exploring this weekend. He's the co-founder of the Flow Genome Project, a company that's dedicated to optimizing and decoding ultimate human performance. And he's also a highly sought after speaker all over the world. And Jamie was a speaker at Awaken Futures 2019, and he gave probably one of the most, if not the most memorable talks of the whole event. And I think one of the reasons that it landed with such potency was because it was really a wake-up call to say, look, it's all good and well building these tools, and they are vital tools, but let's not be naive to the fact that they are co-opting forces like big business and narcissistic opportunists that are getting their grubby hands in the mix, and also not to be naive to the kind of magical and wishful thinking that often comes as well in these conversations and spaces. So Jamie is one of my favorite thinkers in the whole world. He's really leading this charge of a practical and grounded sense for how we actually scale higher human consciousness. And so I've got no doubt you're going to be in for a bit of a treat today. And as per yesterday, there will be Q&A. So Jamie will talk, Q&A for 10 minutes at the end. Again, I'm going to be like a parrot repeating this all day, every day, but go to Meet PS, the Q&A section, and you can be asking questions, then I'll feed them back to Jamie at the end of his talk. So Jamie, over to you, sir.
Beautiful. Thanks, Josh. And thanks for that kind intro. So good morning, everybody. It's a Sunday where I am, and it's before noon. So this is definitely not the kind of content that normally goes on before noon on Sundays, but it's the quarantine edition, and we're all out of fucks. So we're just going to go for it. So with your guys' permission, this is at least 2 days of delivery and teaching, which we're going to try and at least do a high level intro in 30 minutes. And then we will have time for Q&A, and then also time for the additional breakout for folks that are interested in kind of the deeper dives. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we are going to jump in. So Hedonic, engineering and the yoga of becoming, basically a field guide to how we wake up, grow up and show up, a field guide to how we self-initiate into anthropos, right? Truly integrated humanity. That said, you saw the rating on the bottom, NC-17. This is not for kids. This is the unfiltered adult version, and we're just going to jump right in. This is the same slide and the same quote from Bucky Fuller that I led off last year with, and it has just become all the more true. You know, he wasn't wrong 50 years ago. He was just early. Last year, we felt like we were on the kind of tipping point cusp of timing, and now we are clearly all in the thick. And so this is really the project, and this is really the in service of what, which is how do we find our inspiration, connection, and courage to do the things that we must on behalf of ourselves, our children, and our children's children. Pretty straightforward. So that said, there's a little bit, I don't know if you guys have experienced this in the last, say, let's all of 2020, but some kind of disjunct or disorientation around our timelines and our life arcs. Because for most of us born in the times and places we've been born, we've had the blessing and almost the indulgence of really having the only question. We've had our baseline material wants and needs met many times over. And really the only question we had to try and solve for is, what's my hashtag best life? So it was this eternal and sort of non-time bounded project of how do I come most fully alive, right? And David Brooks even wrote a piece in the New York Times last year about even the evolution of marriage and how marriage used to be, you know, convenience, political alliances, economics, all those kind of things. There was the evolution of romantic love, but then lately, like the last several decades, became the realm of like, marriage is supposed to be for self-actualization. And if my partner isn't helping me live my best life, I get to divorce them. That's grounds for breach of contract. Carol Dweck at Stanford, who famously writes about mindsets, has said the same thing about jobs. The idea that we have fixated onto ourselves that if my job is not like, I don't spring out of bed every day, unbelievably stoked to do everything on my plate, then not feeling it, boss. I'm going to hopscotch off and go and do something else. So we've been very much in this coming alive arc, which again is indefinite and not time constrained. And then sort of lately, we've been like, whoa, shit, which is really not news to any outgroups, any indigenous populations, anybody in the global south, really anybody other than Western Europe and Northern North America. But let's just face it, we have been facing this sudden arc of like, holy shit, maybe there's time constraints. Maybe I don't get to do everything I always dreamed of, right? Maybe there's triage. And this intersection between coming alive and staying alive feels a little bit like what this year and potentially what this decade is feeling like. And it is a little crazy making, because there's the what is my indefinite arc of fulfillment and expression versus what might we have the time, the opportunity, and the resources to even attempt. And as a result of that, right, we are finding ourselves, if you guys know good old-fashioned Greek, right, there's the difference between different types of stress. And distress is negative, it breaks us down. Eustress is actually healthy and positive. It actually builds us up. That's like lifting weights, and that tears down our muscles, but when they knit together, they come back stronger. That's eustress, right? The idea of doing a high, hard goal, committing to an artistic project, building a Burning Man camp, whatever you want to say, like eustress is a healthy thing that makes us stronger over time. But for most of us right now, we're stuck in fibrillation, right? We are in the technical term is shit or go blind. Right? Every morning we kid our news feeds, we scroll through what's next, what's new, what's different. We have both of our amygdala, which is kicking us into basically threat detection, like what should I be watching for, right? Back to that staying alive arc, plus dopamine loops, right? Which we know have already been optimized via social media and most of the ways we interact with the world. But they're also, dopamine isn't just pleasure, like, oh, look, I got a notification or someone liked my Instagram post. Dopamine is actually hardwired for two things: novelty, what is new or different, and salience, right? What's going to make me feel awesome or kill me. And so you've got dopamine and amygdala, right, fused together in our bodies and brains right now, coupled with the digital platforms that we're all pretty familiar with right now. What that's leaving us with is the equivalent of ventricular fibrillation, where our hearts are just quivering. They're not contracting and expanding and pulsing life through us. And if you've ever seen Grey's Anatomy or any show like that, or ER, what do they do with the paddles, right? People often think that's to start people's hearts. It's not. Those electrical paddles are actually to flatline people's hearts when they're fibrillating, so that the natural electrical impulse can kick back in. And author Alice Walker, the one who wrote Color Purple and a ton of other books, she wrote that beautifully. She said, the heart opens and the heart closes. And if it didn't, we wouldn't be alive. So the question for us is, how do we get out of fibrillation in the middle, perpetual micro PTSD, distress? How do we reboot our nervous systems and our psychology so that we can experience healthy peaks and deep recovery, right? So that we can return to health. Now, I shared a working definition of what you might call enlightenment, since this is a conference about all things ascendant and kind of peak state seeking and integrating. And I would propose that rather than thinking of enlightenment, awakening, take your pick, as any idealized fixed point, think of it more of the simple thing, which is that awakening, functional awakening in the 21st century in a secular sense, not monastic, not hanging out in someplace in the mountains away from life, but like life, family, kids, work, reality, right? All of it, governance, politics, civics. That a functional definition is simply the ability to match the state I'm in to the task at hand, to what's happening in my environment. And if I can do that skillfully and fluidly, right, I am actually a highly engaged, highly effective person. And like a mountain biking fork, right, I need range in the states that I can healthily adopt and access. But I also need rebound the ability for me to return to center, because otherwise, if I just took one hit and that was it, then, you know, it's a one-hit wonder. I have to be able to come back to center so that I'm ready for the next response. And I also need dampening. I need the ability to absorb energy, which comes at us any old way in life, and then dissipate it, right, in a way that lets me keep rubber on the road, lets me maintain steering. So given that, right, given the idea that abandon a fixed goal of enlightenment as sort of just, you know, non-dual void or whatever, and start considering functional or pragmatic enlightenment to be access to range, rebound, and dampening. That gives us a chance to actually start engineering this. And what does that look like? Right? What does that look like is access to peak states in a skillful manner, ecstasis, inspiration, access to healing in a regular, periodized manner, not just a one and done, right? We've got a lot of profound and encouraging studies about MDMA and trauma work, about psilocybin, about all of these experiences and events, but that's often retroactive historic trauma. These are the hits I've taken over time. They're often acute or intense, particularly if I've found myself in a treatment or research project. But then there's also just life as it keeps happening. So how do we do that? And then finally, connection. How do we actually balance and integrate this as social primates? And how do we do this together? And the subheading here, which comes from Zorba the Greek, right? That great old, if I were a rich man, biddy, 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 right? That one. And it's basically, actually, that's not it. That's Fiddler on the Roof. Okay. Zorba the Greek, different story, but a really good one too, where he talks about the full catastrophe of life. And he's talking about marriage, and he's talking about children, and he's talking about work, and he's talking about trying to keep it all together. And that to me feels really beautiful and really important. Because this isn't just about number one. This isn't just about how do we hack our way to God consciousness, right? This is about how do we inevitably get dragged down through the floorboards to the pits of our despair and grief and suffering. How do we pick ourselves back up dancing? And how do we do it together joyfully in culture? And if you think about African-American culture, if you think about Jewish culture, if you think about any and all indigenous cultures that have experienced centuries, right, of grief and trauma and have found ways to dust themselves off and renew and reconnect and reaffirm, that feels like kind of where we might be these days. So with Awakened Futures, right? Awakened Futures is about these three specific areas. And this is very congruent with the model I laid out in Stealing Fire, which was saying there are 4 forces of ecstasis right now. There are 4 categories, and it was technology, right? Psychology, of which you can say meditation is a tool within gaining access to interior dimensions. Pharmacology, of which psychedelics are often obviously strong medicine, and neurobiology, what's happening in these realms. And if you think about what's at the center of these three, where's the overlap? It's actually what you could call hedonic engineering, which is how do we take the experiences of joy, pleasure, inspiration, and insight, and how do we not have them be random, erratic, or unpredictable? How do we actually bring 21st century Western rational approach to what has been mystical and magical in the past? And if we want to take a look about how do we do that? How do we go around and around through that sort of 3-legged triad of life, right? If you think about the elements that are closest to evolutionary biology, the ones like basically it's easiest to make the most of things that we're hardwired to do anyway. It means we already have it on board. It means our genetics help us. It means our hormones help us. It means that we're basically wired to do these things. And if we can just learn to influence them, steer them. This is what Bucky Fuller called the trim tab idea, right? Rather than like trying to completely steer a 747, just adjust the trim tabs a little bit here and there, and then you can actually bank and steer the whole plane. And the 5 that we've done the research on that appear to be the most potent and most consistent are breathing. And obviously anybody who's been into Wim Hof or holotropic or pranayama or Kriya, right? You know how strong respiration is. We're hard coded to do it, have to, or we snuff it. Embodiment and movement, right, is another key element. Music even predates language. as a tool of communication with humans, and it is a very strong entrainer of state. Sexuality, no user manual for millions of years, and we've all figured out how to do it. So there's got to be an awful lot of biological encoding there, and substances, which is obviously one of the themes of this conference. So if you take a look, this is kind of our palette or our toolkit for how we can actually begin to engineer these things. And when you combine them, right? When you actually combine them, you find that you can go from long duration experiences, whether that's a 9-day Vipassana retreat, right? Or it's a 12-hour LSD experience, right? Or ayahuasca experience or something in that realm, right? That either takes many, many, many hours and has a long half-life, or takes days or weeks to then master and enact, like a Vipassana retreat. If you actually find yourself working with all of the tools and combining them, you can get higher, you can get in more amplitude out of your experience. You can get into what we loosely call the information layer, right? Where you have heightened access to pattern recognition, meaning making, inspiration, etc., right? And then come back down. And if you can do that, then you can spend more time retaining and integrating these ideas versus just getting blown sky high and then being wrung out, worn out, disintegrated, and requiring tons and tons of time. We're really, really good these days at the macro experience, and we've been flirting with the micro experience for the last decade or so. The place that I would argue we are conspicuously lacking is in the meso experience. What are the weekly, monthly, seasonal practices that can keep us going, keep us digesting our grief, keep us connecting to source and true self, and keep us effective in our actual lives as we're living them? So in a nutshell, this would be the premise, right? For those of you, I'm dating myself a bit, but you might have heard of a book called The Anarchist Cookbook. It was infamous for being the most frequently stolen book out of libraries. And it came out in, I think, the late 80s, and it's been legendary, but it was basically like how to build bombs with materials under your kitchen sink, right? So consider this not the Anarchist Cookbook, but consider it the Alchemist Cookbook, which is how might we engage in practices of radical self-initiation with common household materials. So that's the project. So given that, we're going to have to undo a few fuses and wires, because this is volatile territory, right? The only time that these kinds of topics have been discussed is in the East, in the esoteric Dzogchen and Tantric traditions, and in the West, in the Hermetic sex magic traditions. So as a result, anytime you come across people in secular situations engaging with all these tools, sex, drugs, rock and roll, it looks like, you know, a bachelor party in Vegas. It looks like debauchery. And if there's not right intention behind the use and misuse of these tools and approaches, it absolutely can be. So the goal here is to actually say, hey, can we snip the wires? Can we snip the preconceptions? Can we undo the taboos? And can we bring this back into deliberate, intentional, conscious, ethical practice? Okay, so that's the jam. And I think actually, I think we have a quiz to see which of these you most strongly identify with, because when it comes to relating to peak states, non-ordinary states, and particularly pleasant ones, we typically find ourselves in one of these three buckets. So it's the hedonist, the conformist, and the purist. And if you think about each of them has a different core identity, right? The hedonist is out there to suck the marrow out of life. They're a sensation seeker. The conformist is there to fundamentally do what they're told, do what they're supposed to, follow the rules. The purist is quite attached to who they are in their pursuit of spirituality, wholeness, and growth. Chogyam Trungpa called this spiritual materialism, but it's the trap of, right, when you become fixated on the very ego-dissolving tools that are supposed to get rid of your ego, and they actually inflate it further. But this is very much who I am. Catchphrases: hedonist, man, let's do it, right? If it feels good, do it. Conformist, well, if the doctor wrote a prescription, if it's what the doctor ordered, it must be good, right? And a purist might say, hey, my body's my temple. What is the hedonist missing? The hedonist is missing the brakes. The conformist is missing the steering. They're just on the rails of socially defined approved behavior. And the purist might be missing the accelerator. They might actually be a little cautious in keeping themselves within their comfort zone. Substances of choice: cocaine, champagne, and reefer, said Buddy Guy, right? Well, he didn't say the cocaine part, he said the champagne and reefer, right? The conformist: Ambien, Adderall, Prozac, alcohol, right? Crazy drugs, right? Nicotine, right? But if they're socially approved and legal and or prescribed, they're fine. Never mind the side effects. And throw in Klonopin, right? So heavy hitting benzodiazepines. All of those are fine because if they're prescribed, they must be okay. And then finally, the purist might be more along the lines of the fresh juices, the elixirs, the cacaos. Okay, what is the weak spot for the hedonist? And I want you guys tracking which one you think you most strongly identify with. And so we'll have a quick survey at the end here. The Achilles heel is addiction. Obviously, if they taste everything and they say, damn the rules, the chance for them to overclock and get hooked on something sticky is high. The conformist, the Achilles heel is compliance. Like, pick your head up, take responsibility for your own information and decision versus just deferring to authorities or customs or norms. And the purist is pride, right? We talked about that with the trunk bow thing. The resistance, the kind of shadow, passive aggressive movement might be, nobody tells me what to do, right? For the hedonist, like, you're not the boss of me. I get to taste it all. And anybody who's trying to clip my wings, fuck you, right? The conformist might be a little bit of like, well, I might try something else, but oh my gosh, what would the neighbors think? Oh my gosh, what would my parents think? Oh my gosh, right? Who would I be if I stepped outside this narrowly defined social track? And for the purist might be, hey, anything that's not in my practice, anything that's not meditation and yoga, etc., is cheating, right? And that I don't need that. I've got, I've got it all taped myself. Now, what underpins these things? Because the core values are important, right? For the hedonist, it's like, I don't want to, right? I want to skid across the finish line, at the end of my life, having sucked the marrow out of life. I want the fullest range of experience. The conformist is saying, hey, I really value professional opinion. I don't know everything, and I'm not going to go roll the dice on my life, my health, my sanity, right? Without having the go ahead and the A-OK of smarter, more informed folks than me. And then finally, the purist says, I really care about this bodily vessel. I care about my mind. I care about earning my experiences, right? So let's just have a quick, can we see, I don't know where these results would show up, Josh, but have we launched that survey? Have we had any luck with that?
Sorry, I was muted there, Jimmy. Yeah, so if everybody goes to Meet PS, we'll have a survey, a poll set up by the end. Okay. If everyone has their, sorry,
yeah,
Jimmy?
even just bang it into the chat. That's totally fine. And we can just play with, well, where was our initial orientation? How did we come this far in our life? Because the real thought is, how do we take the best of the core values of each of these, full range of experience, also relying on evidence, right, and expert opinion, and maintaining sanctity of body and self? Can we put all those together? And might it look something like hedonic engineering? Okay. That said, you start playing with everything under the sun, and you can put yourself in a ditch in a hurry. There's a reason that it was only true in the esoteric, tantric, and sex magic traditions that anything along these lines was ever discussed. And there's a reason that we have an awful lot of social taboos against the people that play in this realm, because, spoiler alert, it's rarely ended well, right? So don't do stupid shit, right? We have the keys to the kingdom. So don't end up in a cult, a body bag, a jail cell, a loony bin, court, or rehab. You'll fuck it up for the rest of us, right? So there's profound responsibility that comes with liberating technology, right? And to that last one, the notion of rehab, it's really important as we start getting under the hood of all of that evolutionary encoding, right? Remember the respiration, movement, music, sexuality, substances. That's the hat trick of all the things that make us come alive. You start tweaking with that stuff skillfully. At first, you're like, I'm not even sure this is going to work. And then you're suddenly like, it's like, was it deck chair Danny? Like putting helium balloons on his lawn chair, and then suddenly he's 20,000 feet off the deck. You're like, oh shit, right? And the three most obvious ways to come unglued: physiological addiction, right? You start playing with things that are sticky, you can get stuck. The next is psychological. Well, this feels so good. I love that sensation, and I go back more often than I should. But the final one, which isn't really discussed in clinical literature and sort of not noted in the DSM manual, is super duper true for a community like this one, which is particularly with psychedelics, which have nominally neither physiological nor psychologically addictive traits, right? Can, and you could throw this into smart tech too, right? Can, in fact, provide overwhelmingly compelling and interesting information. So ontological addiction is, I keep going back to the wishing well, not because I'm craving it and I'm going cold turkey, not because I'm masking my day-to-day feelings, but because, oh my God, I'm seeing infinity, and I become convinced that me going back to that wishing well is part of some grand plan or secret hack. John Lilly is a classic example of this, right? Where he continued to, in float tanks with ketamine, go back and go back and go back and go back until it nearly killed him, right? So that said, if any protocol that we're coming across informs or challenges an ethical, moral, religious, legal, professional, or personal boundary for you, it's really simple. Just don't do that part. That's it. Just back it out of the stack, right? That said, if you're going to back out key elements that actually are effective catalysts for interior transformation, then you just need to increase the intensity or the duration of whatever else you're doing in your hedonic engineering protocol. So I hope that tracks for everybody. So everybody has 1,000,000% permission. Honor your own voice, honor your own values, honor your own boundaries, proceed only as far as full and clear consent. And along those lines, super, super encouraged. Find yourself, and this is Dan Savage always talks about the 3 G's for good lovers. He talks about good, giving, and game. All right, I think you can say the same about your doctor. If you can find a doctor that is courageous, connected, and curious, you need one to play this game well and to play this game in a sanctioned and legal format. Okay, so basically having a close, collaborative, supportive relationship with a skillful C-cube doctor is essential to go down this road in a sanctioned format. Now, finally, on the caveats is, and I wondered about this because there's so many train wreck stories. There's so many cautionary tales of people playing in this realm, right, with all of these experiences and exposures, and they come unglued. And when they've come unglued, people often jump up on the high horse and go, see, they were a charlatan. See, they were full of shit. See, and you realize, and I was thinking about this like a month ago. I'm like, well, wait a second. That's not how we treat mountaineers that die. That's not how we treat big wave surfers that drown. We actually, if they didn't do it, if they weren't stupid, you hold them up, right? They were heroes pioneering, pushing the envelope. And so the same thing with this. This is not safe. But neither are big men. In fact, Suzuki Roshi said, he said, you will find no reasonable men on the tops of great mountains, right? So whether it's riding giants in the ocean or whether it's big mountains or whether it is some form of, basically a yoga of becoming, not safe, but also profound in what it can disclose and reveal about ourselves and about the world and about the universe. So this is what it all looks like. If you put this up on a map, now this is a 2D map of multidimensional human neurobiology, psychology, physiology. So it's not perfect, but as far as something you can compress onto a screen, it's decent. And it's basically saying that in a nutshell, the left-hand side of things is where we spend most of our time, and it looks like tired, wired, and stressed, right? Remember that mountain bike fork idea? Our fork has kind of got stuck here. But if we can unstick it, we get to go over to the right-hand side and we get to experience more range. And when we experience that more range, it tends to show up, basically tired, wired, and stressed is high prefrontal cortical activity, right? A lot of executive function, a lot of default mode network, typically high norepinephrine and cortisol, right? Typically an erratic heart rate with low heart rate variability, typically rolled, poor posture, typically bad air exchange. We might even be hypocapnic, which means we're over breathing and we've dropped our CO2 too low. So we have poor oxygenation. It's a very, we typically are in, as I said, agitated beta EEG. right? So you can kind of see that. And you're like, oh, well, shit, I don't have to spend hours on a couch and I don't have to bung down a bunch of SSRIs to shift that. In fact, any toolkit that shifts me over to the right is likely also going to shift my interior lived experience. And instead of having to get to better accidentally by telling different stories or again, medicating or engaging in talk therapy, I can actually just shift the knobs and levers and then see who I am and see what life feels like on the right-hand side. So that said,
Two minutes, 2 minutes till the end of time.
2 minutes to the end of time. Well, that was a hell of a wind-up to get to the very beginning of the interesting stuff. So what I will simply say then, I guess we'll do this for our breakout. I will leave you with this, right? Terence McKenna famously argued the case for the stoned ape theory of evolution, namely that as apes got down out of the jungle, wandered into the savannah, they came across herds of animals on their dung, grew mushrooms, and from there we ate and logos, and we became clever apes, right? And questionable theory, lots of dots to connect, and not a lot of evidence to be able to do so. But more importantly, I think you can make a case that in fact it is the potential of sexuality as one of those long levers that is far more likely, right, to be ubiquitous and pervasive across the entire population, and has had something unique in humans. We are the only creatures to consistently make love outside of estrus or specific times of copulation. Everything from women's breasts and mammary glands to men's oversized penises. I mean, gorillas are like 600 pounds and have 1.5-inch penises. So like Jared Diamond, the guy who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, has done a fascinating study on this, which is why are we wired the way we are to make love the way we do? And is that not possibly the secret key to our unlocking and leveling up of human consciousness? So, with that, can I go 1 more minute just to tell the story of Lily? Okay. So now to bring this into how did we get to here and how do we even start tracking this as a thread? We were coming at it from neuroscience, peak performance, all this stuff. In researching Stealing Fire, came across John Lilly's research in the 50s, and he was mapping the ecstatic neural circuitry of primates, specifically rhesus monkeys. And he discovered that that circuitry maps one-to-one with the sexual arousal network. Makes sense. I mean, once again, evolution is efficient, right? But that's what it does. Betty Dodson, who was just recently on Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop, right now in her 90s, and wild ass, awesome woman, but she was one of the pioneers of sex positive orgasm training for women. She created a rock and roll technique for helping anorgasmic women climax, and it involved spinal and pelvic tilting, interior bandhas or muscle contractions, and breath work. And she took a group of 484 anorgasmic women. Women had never been able to climax, and 480 were able to as a result of her work. In our conversations with Rick Doblin at MAPS, he identified that the role of MDMA in their PTSD therapy was in fact high oxytocin, high prolactin, high vasopressin, and that was giving people a feeling of safety, connectedness, belonging, and an ability to revisit trauma in healthy ways to reformat it. The closest they found to that analog was post-orgasm. So you're like, oh, wow, okay, that's 30 years and millions of dollars to get us to MDMA, tightly controlled and controversial compound. Or how else might you get to a post-orgasmic state where you might be able to go back and revisit trauma? And then finally, Dr. Nicole Prousey at the Kinsey Institute has been researching orgasm as a replacement to SSRIs as a prescription pharmaceutical. So we started following that thread, and we started seeing those researchers and those contributors, and we're like, hey, we think that there is potentially a 21st century Western update to what has been under the covers, under the hood of both Eastern and Western esoteric traditions. So that's the tee up, and I guess I'll say it now. If anybody would like to actually get into the details, we will be doing that in our breakout. Thanks, Josh.
Jamie, thank you. There is probably about 100 comments in the chat saying, please, please, please let this man continue. But you will get a chance to hear Jamie just in a little bit. He will be hosting a breakout for 1 full hour where you can ask him as many questions as you want. But I just want to go back to the poll quickly that was done before. We have 49% of the audience are hedonists, 10% conformists, no surprise there, and 40% purists. And I think we got time for just a couple of questions. One of them is, what are some ethical, productive ways to introduce teenagers, mainstream adults, and elderly people to this type of content? It's like a mainstreaming question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is why I didn't actually get to the heart of it. So even for a community like this, where pretty much everyone's all in on jumping, it is grabbing the third rail, right? And this is twice I've tried to give this talk and I've got this far. I have not yet actually been able to deliver the content. So I'm psyched for the breakout. So it is tricky. But I think the simplest, I'm writing the sequel to Stealing Fire right now, and it is an attempt to do exactly this. So this is kind of the thesis in a nutshell. B, I think just simple positive sex education and sex positivity is awesome and amazing. So in the same way that not everybody's cut out to become a psychonaut and really go back to the well regularly on psychedelics, I would say that the same would be true of sexual healing, basically. So I think first start with just healthy and positive information, removal of shame, right? And basic, technical instructions so that everyone has as their birthright pleasure and release as nothing else, just as a sexual practice, like literally as a sexual yoga. And then from there, much deeper conversation around trust, partnership, boundaries, progression, et cetera, et
cetera. One big takeaway from your talk last year, there was a sort of relatively pessimistic perspective on the way things are with regards to these tools and them being co-opted. I'm just curious to know, like, what is your current take on our current predicament, corona-wise, as it pertains to, and larger crisis-wise, as it pertains to these tools?
Yeah, I think what we can be fairly certain we are getting, whether we want it or not, is Prozac Nation 2.0. Now brought to you with like new and improved 5-HT2A receptor sites, right? So we will get the pure commodification of psychedelics, but we will also have the ongoing underground, which has always been here, and we will also have the evolution of sacramental practices and techniques. The reason that I'm talking here about kind of like the alchemist cookbook, like how do we do this ourselves, is because to me, that's the only thing that is decentralized, open source, scalable, and anti-fragile. So my hope would be is if everybody can take this as our birthright and as our secret, our own technologies of remembering and becoming and healing, that we have a chance to access basically soul force, like bottomless courage, out of fucks, here's my stand. Because my sense is that nothing is trending in happy directions right now at all. And it looks like it's going to get way worse before there's any kind of near misses. And whew, wasn't that amazing? We got just the wake up call we needed. This is looking like we're going to need really strong, courageous voices for the foreseeable future. And there's no way to do that if we just shoulder the burden without an ability to reset our nervous systems, recommit our hearts, right? And sort of set down our burdens from time to time. So I think it's a long way. I think we got a lot to do. And back to that coming alive arc, like it might not even be about our lifetimes anymore. It might be we're doing this for our children and our children's children. And that's how, again, that's the Hebrews wandering in the desert for 40 years. It's a bunch of models, but like we may be like, the easy days are behind us. And right now we're doing this for our descendants.